So how to maximize this kind of data? How do we use it in immigrant integration, in policy, in advocacy, and in education to mobilize foreign-born populations, tap into very important funding, and bring about changes in policy that benefits all Americans? This discussion is going to be on how to use data and research, not answering specific research content questions. And we invite from Boston, Massachusetts, Alejandra Senguien, who is the director of the Mayor's Office for Immigrant Advancement, formerly the Mayor's Office for New Bostonians. She's leveraging public-private partnerships to launch new initiatives for immigrant integration, and she was previously director of OISTE, a statewide Latino civic and political organization. We're also happy to welcome from Valhalla, New York, Terry Wiesel, who is the executive director of the Community College Consortium for Immigrant Education, and she's also associate dean at Westchester, committed to community outreach to those who would benefit from a community college education. From Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Amanda Bergson-Shilcock is the senior policy analyst at the National Skills Coalition. She works on coordinating the network of members to address issues facing immigrant workers. She was previously vice president of policy and evaluation at the Welcoming Center for New Pennsylvanians. And from Fairfax, Virginia, Dr. James Whitty, director of the Institute for Immigration Research at George Mason, where Justin was just speaking from. He's also the director of the Center for Social Science Research and professor of sociology, currently focusing on the survey of immigrant communities in the Washington, D.C. area. So we're happy to welcome all of our panelists. If you all can just switch on your cams now, and let's do a little check-in with audio. Great to see you, Jim, Terry, Alejandra, and Amanda. I assume we'll see you very, very shortly. Thank you for joining us, everyone. And I want to jump right into the discussion. Can everyone see and hear clearly?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Jim?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yep. And Terry? Terry, I think you're muted for some reason, so you might want to just check on that a little bit. And then let's begin. So, let's get right into the discussion. How do we put this data into use? We just learned how to access very specific immigration data. Give me some examples on how you have used it specifically to advance change in your specific areas. So tell me some stories of what your experience using data has been. Perhaps we can start with you, Alejandra.
Sure, absolutely. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being on the webinar. I'll try not to move back and forth too much. So one of the things I was thinking about this because we use data on a regular basis. But one of the things most recently is how we impact the citywide policy that we wouldn't necessarily be considered to be a part of. So for example, Boston has embarked on a race equity and resiliency project. And for us, it was hugely important that the immigrant and foreign-born and children of immigrants be part of that. So, as people may know, Boston has a very tense racial history, and a lot of it, from the 70s is very black and white. And so our population, our diversity of immigrants really came in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So if you're talking about what happened years ago, like with busing, you have a very different population than the one you have now. So being able to show how the data and where immigrants are and the statistics on how they're the disparities, the same disparities that Black Americans have, then we were able to integrate the two processes. So we now have a race equity process that is now also includes a very strong immigrant advancement lens. And that was all, we had to show that through data. There was no other way to demonstrate that.
And I know that you've done a lot of work at the city level and the county level. Jim, what has your experience been like from the research perspective, developing these things, putting them out there, engaging with communities, with state and city officials?
Yeah, thank you, Denzil. Our job really is to provide the data, and I think that's really what Justin was describing. And, what we really work very hard on is, and have evolved this over time with the IDOD service, is listening to potential users and saying, we're not going to just try to imagine what kind of data people need, but the importance of IDOD is you tell us what data you need, and then we provide that for you. And we see it, with some people, it's going to be a one-shot service, giving people exactly what they need at one point in time. But we're also hoping to begin to build some partnerships to say, okay, this is what we can do with IDOD, and now let's think about ways to grow that effort, to collaborate further over time, and use information to effectively articulate the contributions of immigrants.
And what kind of partners are you referring to?
Well, there are a couple of avenues. Again, if someone needs for a particular issue or a decision things that we can get out of IDOD, that's great. But then there are other cases where we begin to work together. I think the Steps to Success project, where we gathered data on 6 cities, and then using that initial data, we went out and went to the Corporation for National and Community Service and got a much larger project to look at the role that immigrants play in civic engagement and volunteering around the country. So I think it's not just here's the data and see what you can say with it, but let's begin a conversation around the data to do something that we like to refer to as informed activism.
Informed activism, that's a great point. And Amanda,
Hello?
Yes, Amanda, are you there?
Denzil, this is Amanda. I'm sorry, for some reason the camera part of my presentation is not working, but we're working on that. But I'd love to follow up on that idealism, both in my work today at National Skills Coalition and previously at the Welcoming Center for the New Pennsylvanians and Imprint. We regularly use the kind of data that we've just seen Justin describe here to make the case to policymakers, but also in community, to a local chamber of commerce or at a library or to a Rotary Club, to help demystify part of what's going on with immigrant integration and give folks some hard and rigorous data around the changes that are happening in their communities. So I think that one of your colleagues at the ILC is going to share a couple of links in the chat box, but one of the ways that I did that in my prior job was by creating congressional district snapshots. So they were essentially profiles of the immigrant population in a congressperson's district. And that can be a really beneficial tool when you're going in to meet with legislative staff to illustrate for them sort of who their constituents are. And it's always a good door opener for a conversation with an elected official when you can bring information specific to their district. And then we also did a lot of juxtaposing practitioner examples with the data, right? So you have data from the census or the American Community Survey that tells you kind of big population level facts about how many people have college degrees or how many people have are coming from a particular part of the world, and then you juxtapose that with a photo and a little blurb about a person who's giving you permission to use their story to really humanize it and make it clear that we're not just talking about numbers on a piece of paper, but we're talking about people who are dentists, who are taxi drivers, who are home health aides, who are farm workers, whoever the group may be. So those are two of the ways in which we've most used data, both, as I said, in my prior job, but also today in my work with NSC. And hopefully you have those links in the chat box so you can see examples of what I'm talking about, but I know that you'll also be receiving them by email after this webinar is over.
That's correct. And we're talking about, congressional officials. How do you communicate the research to administrators and principals, people involved in education, Terry? We're still not hearing you. I think you might want to, it might be a good idea just to use your cell phone.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I hope you don't get an echo here. I'm on my cell phone. So from the practitioner's level and at an educational level, I think that this data becomes so critical. In fact, I have a feeling that you have hundreds of people sort of salivating and waiting to get their hands on your form and get their information to George Mason. But we've used data here at Westchester Community College to drive very large college-wide strategic initiatives, as well as more practical program development, especially in our English as a Second Language programs. And so in a county like Westchester that has such a dichotomy of population, a level of affluence that's very, very high, but also cities with very large immigrant populations and very high need, we've been able to state our case to funders, to the state, to our county sponsors, to the degree that we had an enormous capital campaign and a building built in 2010, specifically focused on our role as the educational resource for our immigrant community. And we were able to galvanize the support we needed to do that kind of large level work by having the data at a municipal level and at a county and regional level that supported the great need and the potential resource that the college could be in serving their immigrant communities, our immigrant communities. And so access to this data, especially at a time of such limited resources, becomes really critical for us as educators.
And give us some examples. I think you and Alejandra can just give us some very specific examples of exactly what kind of data we're talking about. What proved most effective in each of your areas of work? Terry?
Well, for us, I think at the community college level, we're looking at data, obviously, on educational levels of our immigrants in their respective communities, of the level of English language proficiency that is spoken, of the occupational backgrounds and the skills gaps that might be presented so that we're able to contextualize English as a second language along with our skills training and our job readiness work. Those would be some examples.
Alejandra?
Sure. So one of the things that I was thinking of, Boston was one of the cities for Steps to Success, and we were able to do a panel here. And what we did is we brought in people from other departments, so the cabinet chief from economic development, to be a panelist. And it was an interesting way to get him involved and also get him to hear the data. And so from there, we were, it was his idea to start a task force on high-skilled immigrants, which is something that never would have happened had we not had that panel, had not invited him, not just to come, but to also to present. So I think, was an advocate in my former life, but continue to be an advocate in this role, because I think there's really a lack of information even within city departments about the populations and how many people there are. I think the city oftentimes, and another important thing, the city oftentimes goes off of a complaint-based system. So if, you ask, why do you need a communications access ordinance? No one's calling our 311, our information line that speaks another language. Well, they don't call because they don't know about it, or they've called and they've had a bad experience. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. So that's when you bring in the real data and say, actually, these are your limited English, and hugely important is the percentages of linguistically isolated households, because that is a large, that's 12% of our immigrant population are linguistically isolated. And so that gives even more of an impetus to do a communications access ordinance, and it really impact the way that different agencies do their outreach and where they're doing their outreach and so forth.
And Amanda, give us some insight as not just a consumer of research, but also a researcher yourself and a writer. How do we present data? Give us some tips, some best practices on, does it vary by audience? What should we avoid doing when communicating about the research? Give us some ideas from your experience.
I think the first and most important thing is that anytime you're preparing data, you should rely on someone who doesn't work at your organization to be a test reader for you. So whatever you're preparing, you should get a neighbor, a friend, a roommate, your mother-in-law, somebody who doesn't work in this field, to take a look at your flyer, your handout, your PowerPoint, and tell you what they think they learned from it. So regardless of the kind of advocacy materials you're developing, having that sort of test loop can enable you to see if the message that you think you're conveying is actually the message that you're conveying. Two other things that I think are really important. One is the use of color, and the other is the use of cue words, right? So when you're making a pie chart or a graph, this may sound so simple and obvious, but I see it violated all the time. That is, make sure that your most important piece of information is in the brightest or most eye-catching color, right? So if you're trying to communicate something about how many people have college degrees, you don't want the big chunk of folks with college degrees to be in gray and the chunk of everybody else to be in bright red. You want it to be the other way around. And the second is with regard to I'm not sure why screen sharing is coming up, I think because Justin is going to display some lovely images. Wonderful, great use of color. But the second is about cue words, right? And so it's often common for researchers, and it's understandable because this is how researchers are trained, to put a headline on top of a chart or a graph that just says things like age distribution of immigrants. Well, that's a nice, factual, neutral phrase, and there may be times when you need that phrase to be used. But if you're trying to tell a story, it can be easier to make your headline actually a sentence that tells the story. So the headline could be something like, immigrants are more likely to be working age, or immigrants are primarily female, or majority of immigrants today come from Asia, whatever that story might be. So between those three facts and those three techniques, rather, sort of having an external person look at your publication before you take it on the road, having the use of color and the use of cue words and headlines are really important in making sure that your data actually tells the story that you hope and wish that it's telling. And the last thing I'll just mention on this is that it's often hard for those of us who are immersed in immigration work to know about the mistaken assumptions that other people may be carrying around. So for example, a lot of folks don't necessarily understand that immigrants' kids, if they're born here in the U.S., would not show up in the foreign-born data, right? They show up in the native-born data because they're U.S. citizens. But that's the kind of thing that if you're doing a chart of immigrant and native-born by age, you would want to have a little explainer on the chart that says, immigrants' children, if born in the U.S., are included in the native-born data. So you're sort of telegraphing to your audience a couple of key phrases or things to keep in mind to help them understand the data that's being put in front of them so that they don't leap to the wrong conclusion.
Can I add one thing? Also, and those are really great points. And another thing that I was thinking about also is that making sure that your data is appropriate. So from my perspective, I'm not doing the actual research. I'm taking research from George Mason. I'm taking research from Amanda. I'm taking the research and presenting it. But it's really important for me to know my audience. So I might have a certain level of certain data from the whole population as a whole of the foreign born. But if I'm presenting in front of the Boston Public Schools, I should actually really dig a lot deeper, because that population might not reflect the actual total population, particularly as we talk about children of immigrants, and also very importantly talk about refugees and in other places that might not pop up in your top 10 list of the foreign born. So knowing your audience, I've made that mistake before. Knowing your audience is super important in digging into that. So I really love the data on demand, because I feel like that's going to be hugely helpful as we think about presenting to a diverse group of audiences.
And from the educator's perspective, Terry, what do you see missing in the data? What data would you like to see that would be extremely valuable for you when it comes to immigrant students? I think you're on mute again.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yes. I would welcome data about persistence in programs once immigrants are back enrolled, secondary level outcomes data about their completion of short-term credentials. I think all of those data points are important for us as educators as we continue to justify specifically focusing some of our grant projects, some of our specific work and programs on this population per se. So whether it's programs specifically targeted to high-skilled immigrants or short-term credentials that combine English language acquisition and skills training, the outcomes data, and of course that kind of data is incumbent on us as well to collect the attainment of those technical skills of immigrants, but that kind of data I think would be specifically beneficial for us.
Yeah, and Terry, even just from this conversation, you've given us some great ideas. You know, because it's this conversation where we can begin to recognize what some of your data needs are. And as soon as we get off the call, Justin is going to be given a task, which is going to be how do we link in IPEDS data, the Integrated Post-Secondary Educational Data System, into our database. You know, so their understanding what you need allows us to think about how we can serve you better and create new resources within IDOD and our overall data system.
So that's excellent, Josh. And I think, you know, when I think of Perkins and other kinds of outcomes, data collection, that it's incumbent upon us to keep track of, and where that we can have that overlap, I think would be really critical.
And I want to bring it back to you, Jim. When it comes, we have a lot of people who work for refugee resettlement agencies, who work directly with refugees. And we are seeing refugees in many different parts of the country right now. Guide us through, very briefly, if you can, what it would take to do some very local research on refugee populations, because we know so little about them.
Well, I think that's, again, where this conversation can go, and where we've looked, for example, as we present IDOD data, and people can then begin to use that to make a case not only at a superficial or first glance level of what an issue is, but then also point out the need for local data that fits the gaps that are present. You know, right now we have a conversation coming up with people at CASA, you know, formerly Casa de Maryland, and we've got some first glimpses of educational issues for primarily children of immigrants in areas they serve. And now we can begin to say, okay, let's look for a potential funding source that will give us the opportunity to collect more data, and particularly to evaluate programs that they're using to see to what degree are they effective, and can they then serve as models for other programs in other parts of the country. So I think it's this, you know, taking a first glance with data that's already available, then points out, okay, what can we do to supplement that? And it could be something like IPEDS, where people like Terry and all the universities around America are putting a lot of time and energy into creating this data set. But what we see with our database approach is now merge that with other sources of information, either collected for other purposes or that we then go out and collect for ourselves, like Amanda and I did with the Steps for Success project.
And you mentioned going out and seeking funding. We would have a lot of interest in how to access funding. When it comes to using data in order to get funding, or trying to get funding for data, what is that process like? Perhaps Amanda and Alejandra can just give us a little bit of insight there.
Sure. I can share a couple of examples. The first is it's always easier to start a discussion with the goal that your funder is already trying to accomplish, right? So a number of states right now, for example, have set a goal of a percentage of their population that wants to earn a post-secondary credential by the year 2025. If that's a goal that your funder or your potential funder is trying to reach, then perhaps the most useful data to present to them can be the percentage of immigrants who could be part of meeting that credential attainment goal. To say, okay, if you fund our organization to provide education and workforce services, this is how you can meet that broader goal. And so one of the examples we shared in the chat box a little while ago was a 2-page fact sheet that my organization produced for Arizona around middle skill credential attainment in Arizona and the role of immigrants in helping reach that goal. So if you're applying for funding and your funder has identified a collective impact goal, perhaps that United Way is working towards, or an education goal that a mayor or a city agency is focused on, being able to demonstrate how immigrants are part of the solution can be much more persuasive in terms of encouraging access. The other way that it can be useful is to bring attention to areas where there might be big disparities in equity. So Seattle has done this very successfully because the city of Seattle has something called a Race and Social Justice Initiative, or RISG. And essentially what that means is that city agencies are required to look at their spending of federal dollars through the lens of racial equity. And so the city offices of immigrant affairs looked at the city's spending of community development block grant money, which any city larger than 100,000 people in the U.S. receives, and decided that they wanted to use some of their CSBG money to provide low-level English language learners with adult education and workforce services. So that was an example where the outside impetus was that the city had this race and social justice initiative, but the practical effect was really to look at, what are the assets we have? We have community-based nonprofits who have earned the trust of their community. We have high-quality education providers. What are the sort of other features of the landscape? We have this federal CSBG funding. And then how do we put those pieces together to demonstrate that, gosh, we might not be serving the full array of immigrants that we could be, given the percentage that they make up of our population. And so I also covered that in the last PowerPoint that we shared in the chat box, and that is really to do with WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and the percentage of immigrants served under that. So Alejandra, I don't know what you may want to add from your perspective.
Well, that was all great. And I think also that if you look at how, as a city, so as a city agency, how you're going to collaborate with the funders. And for example, funders often like to see the city put some skin in the game. So if you have, you said, this is very important to us, you can say, this is very important to us. We don't want to put any money in it. Why don't you give us all the money for it? You say, no, this is very important for it. That's why we're putting this much in. Now we also need a researcher that costs this much, or we also, need this new position, which costs this much, and we'll pay for half, So I think that aside from everything that Amanda was saying, you also have to think about, you really talk to your executive, your mayor, town manager, whoever, about what are their priorities, and the thing that Seattle does very well is how is their budget reflecting their racial justice priorities. And so you can use that tool and say, okay, this is what you said, this is a gap. We can't put it in our operating budget, but let's go to this group of funders. Let's, give them the information and let them know, the city is so committed to this that we're also putting our own stake. So I would say, from a city perspective, it's really important to keep that in mind as to what you're bringing to the table when you approach the funders.
And we're having this big conversation about data and research in what is apparently a post-fact era, where there's tremendous mistrust of polling, of surveys, of data. There's fake news. In this new era that we're faced with, apparently, how do you then communicate about data, and how do you deal with anti-immigrant data that's out there? How do you respond to that? How do you argue against it, discredit it? Ideas from Jim?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm teaching a seminar on survey research this very semester, and trying to answer that question for my students is difficult. But I think what you really have to do is go back to, where does the data come from? You have to be as clear as possible. Amanda gave some great guidelines. The one thing I would add to it is always be clear about your denominator. Percentage of what? So really sort of making that clear so that people do not misinterpret your data. You also have to be, and Denzil, you're good at warning us about this, vigilant about how other people are referring to your data. And so if there's some misinterpretation, going out and gently correcting that. And then, as we do here at the IIR, we have a pretty comprehensive fact-checking process, where different sets of eyes, not just our mother-in-law and neighbor, but then other people who are familiar with the data go back and look at it, and if necessary, correct it, and be willing to say, okay, this needs to be corrected. I have my IPM's coffee mug. IPM's is a great data resource, but they have mistakes sometimes. You find a mistake, you get a coffee mug. Encouraging people to have a critical eye on their results is very important, and I think that builds trust among users as well as producers of data.
I would
Terry,
just.
did you want to add something to that?
I would just add, and this is the educator in me, but I would just add that we have an obligation to speak truth to power, and that we don't lose faith, and we stop persisting. And when we have the facts that we know, the data that we know to be accurate, we combine that. I think Amanda said this earlier. We combine that with our success stories, with our champions, with our students, our community members, and leaders who are the evidence of the truth that lies in that data.
And on that note, I'd like to mention one thing that we're going to be putting out from the IIR right after the first of the year. And it's going to be a bundle of fact sheets. It's going to be called 45 Fact Sheets for the 45th President, which will be telling different stories from our facts that we're going to be circulating. I don't know if we'll get it all the way to the Trump administration, but we'll be giving it to people to use for that very purpose, to say, in this very important time, what are some real hard facts about the roles that immigrants are playing in America?
I would just add one more piece that we're learning from folks in a different field around, behavioral psychology, and that is when people have a weak belief in a fact and you share new information with them, they will change their beliefs to match the new information. But when they have a very strong belief in a priority or a value and you present them with information, they are more likely to discard the information you're giving them than to discard their pre-existing belief. So it's important that we have both data, but also stories, because some people who are very deeply committed to information that may be factually incorrect are not necessarily going to be persuaded by additional data, no matter how correct it is. And the librarian in me wants every piece of data footnoted accurately and rigorously. And Jim is smiling because he suffered through a long period of research with me in which we were both back and forth trying to make sure every morsel of data was accurately footnoted. But that is not sufficient, and that we do also need to take those lessons that we're learning from behavioral psychology and from sociology and from other fields about how people come to learn more about the world, and one of those ways is through stories. And so if you haven't already, I would encourage you to check out Senator Dick Durbin's website. Senator Durbin has many times told the story of immigrant dreamers on the floor of the Senate. And on his website are a whole series of profiles that talk about these young dreamers. So it's a very effective example of using storytelling at the highest level in national policymaking.
So I want to wrap up and ask two final questions. This has been a very, very interesting conversation. The one main message of the presidential election for me was how much we need to engage with other people, how much we need to not just to talk to them, but also to listen to them. And we have such walls built up between groups now that it's difficult to hear anyone without calling someone else names. I want to just get one little tip from each of you on how to communicate with people who may be on the other side of our message. Amanda? You had already mentioned.
Yeah,
Did you have anything else?
I would just say two things. The first thing is everybody has values that they share. I'm a librarian. I value information. I value connecting people to resources. And very often, if you're trying to have a policy discussion, but you haven't outlined any common values, it can be really hard to engage in advocacy or to really have any kind of interaction. And so the two things that I do most often when I'm talking with somebody who may not share my policy advocacy positions is first to listen to what they're telling me is important to them. And second, to try to identify where there may be shared values. That's not always possible. I'm not Pollyanna. But where it is possible, being able to talk about family, being able to talk about stories, being able to talk about work as a value. I do skills advocacy. Is really important because you can't get to shared policy change if you don't start with a view of the world. And that view of the world is really very often grounded in what is closest to our hearts, our values, and how we live those values out every day. So I'm a policy advocate. I believe in the power of advocacy to make our world and our public policies better. But I am also completely, I guess I would say, omnivorous. I will use any technique that I can to experiment with ways for people to not just hear me, but for me to hear them. And that includes media sources, that includes channels of communication, podcasts, or social media, or webinars like this one, or writing, or letters to the editor, and I will go anywhere and talk to anyone, including groups that might not necessarily be jumping up and down to have me. So I do think that being very comfortable and willing to step out of your own comfort zone and to start with listening can help understand, because you can't answer a fear-based concern with a logically based set of data. People just feel buried in an avalanche of information and not heard. So you have to start from where folks really are, and sometimes you start with the stomach and not with the head.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that. And I think sometimes some of the hardest part of the immigrant integration work is actually getting the native-born population involved. And so sometimes the way that you do that is, like Amanda's saying, maybe you're not having a discussion on policy, but perhaps you're having a shared dinner or a shared celebration, or I think these micro level connections. And I know that there are a lot of community organizations that have really tried to do that. It's hard in our work. It's really hard to get people in the room who disagree in terms, because we're doing a lot of immigrant advocacy, we're working with immigrant-led organizations. So we don't spend a lot of time with people who don't think like us. And I think that puts us in a bubble. And so we have to be really actively trying to engage with those who differ differ with us. I mean, I would say that probably IGR, the Intergovernmental Relations, would interact much more frequently with people who have different policy views. And so, but our position, we really have to be proactive about making sure we are outreaching to a broader population. Because I agree. I think one thing that this election showed us is that we're not listening to each other. And so it's something that, that we're going to actively try to do in 2017. And I think it actually brings an opportunity to do this because all these issues are now out there and broad and sort of like highlighted right now.
And Terry, from the educator's perspective, education is a very controversial topic in so many ways. How do you do it? What's your advice?
It is controversial, Denzil, but I would say, and confirming what Alejandra and Amanda said, that as educators, we're in a very unique and privileged position to offer a platform for discourse and for hearing all sides of every issue, and for really creating welcoming communities and environments through our curriculum and being able to infuse the immigrant experience into the lens of all that we do, and valuing our student populations and the communities we serve, and valuing the assets that are brought to our educational environments through our immigrant and our native-born populations. And so I think just really confirming what we've heard already.
Okay, and I want to ask one final question as we wrap up this conversation. I think we've learned quite a lot and benefited from each of your perspectives, which is quite distinct where each of you is coming from. We're entering a brand new era in so many ways, and I want you to give our attendees a message. Looking forward, what one thing do you want to leave our attendees with? Is it an innovative idea, a hopeful message, galvanizing and mobilizing, filling out an IDOT survey? Let's start with Jim and end with Amanda, and just very quickly, 10 seconds each.
Well, I would return to the idea of informed activism and really using data to advance a position, listening. You can find this up on our website. We've got between 8 and 9 million tweets that we've collected about immigration, and we've partitioned them into different conversations. And so here you can see the words that, for example, institutional conservatives, people who are talking to one another from that perspective, what words are they using to talk about immigration? Or people who are affiliated with the Tea Party, what words are they using? So I think Amanda makes an excellent point. We've got to listen, and we've got lots of tools now that we can use to be able to listen.
I would say start small. Pick one fact sheet, pick one topic area, pick one small geographic area. Don't sentence yourself to feeling that you have to do everything that we've talked about in today's webinar. Pick one thing and do that thing well.
I think also, just to reiterate the idea of forced connections, the opportunity to be out of your comfort zone, because those are places that you really are able to have the deeper conversations that may not be a huge macro policy level, but really is that hard? Is that changing the heart? So I know it's something that we're committed to do in 2017.
And I would just say for the community college and the university level folks and our K through 12 audience members as well, take an opportunity to find a new partner and work together on, even filling out the IDOD resource forum, and as Amanda said, take on one small project together.
Thank you very much to Dr. Jim Whitty, Terry Wiesel, Alejandra Senguien, and of course Amanda Bergson-Shilcock. It was thrilling to have you all brought together in this mini conference, all for free, and I thank you for devoting your time to this. And looking forward, we know that we have allies in you, and we can rely on you for your expertise